So, if you were experiencing family violence, if you were living in fear for your life, if your actions were being controlled, would you also be out looking for a job? If you didn't get fully paid for the work that you were doing, would you still do it? This is a story more about courage, but I hope compassion's there. And ours is only matching a fraction of what the women are showing through their determination to get jobs. I'm talking today about one aspect of McAuley Community Services work, and that's the women's employment program, McAuley Works. McAuley Works is currently funded through Jobs Victoria, and it's one of about 50 contracts. So the Victorian State Government knew that they had to do something about vulnerable, disadvantaged job seekers in the state because they weren't getting the service that they needed from the federal system, Job Active. McAuley Community Services for Women is a family violence and homelessness response organisation. It's very unusual for us to also have an employment program. So we haven't seen one in Australia that has an employment program matched with family violence response. Our contract specifies 2 payable outcomes, so we get paid on milestones. The first payable outcome is the number of women that we have placed in jobs. And the second is the number of women who achieve 26 weeks of paid employment for no less than 15 hours a week. And we don't get paid if we don't achieve these outcomes and or prove these outcomes. So we have 350 participants currently signed up all across Victoria. This number represents the number of women who want to work. We get 5 referrals every week. We don't advertise, and currently we have 101 women placed in employment. 33 of these women placed in employment we don't get paid for. They're unclaimable. There are 39 outcomes to date, and so we're way behind our contract requirements to have 100 by now. Over 90% of the women that we work with have or are experiencing family violence. That's not to mention the fact that they might have a disability, a mental illness, English as a second language, live in a rural area, have no access to a car. None of those things are coming into what I'm talking about today. We're behind on our outcomes and we are under constant pressure to achieve the goals that we said we would achieve. And this is where our courage wavers. So, under pressure of that contract, we thought we might need to say no to some women who we thought were just never going to get a job. So we undertook an analysis, and this is what I want to show you. Okay, next. Can't even see next. That one? Okay. So I'll explain what you're looking at here. So we developed a matrix. So this is, remember, this is where we were going to start to exclude women from the program. Before we did that, we thought we'd better work out, who were the ones that we were going to exclude. So we developed a matrix with the top row being employability rating. So from poor, and poor means client is unskilled, unqualified, with no specific experience, not having held a position in more than 18 months, not fluent in English, may have a diagnosed mental illness and have a learning disability, existing in accommodation not located in proximity to employment, and limited opportunities to public transport. Right through to excellent. And then on the other side, we had family violence rating from minimal, family violence incident has not occurred in the last 12 months, to critical, being requires immediate protection. So we plotted all of the women that we'd placed in employment. At that time, there were 67 women placed in employment. We plotted them against this graph. And we thought, right, well, who now do we exclude? And what we found, to our astonishment, was most of the women that were placed in employment were in this red section here. Either like 1 in minor, the rest in moderate to critical family violence, and poor to okay average employability rating. These were the women who were getting jobs. So at that time, 46 women placed in jobs in the red zone, as I've just explained, 15 more in the poor to okay employability. And again, this matrix doesn't take into account all of the other stuff that might be going on for women in their lives. So the analysis showed us that we were actually working with the right group of people, the women who wanted to get jobs. So we figure the X factor was their determination, their courage to get a job. So we had to keep going. Not very well paid, I have to say. Now, I don't have a lot of time, so we could see, there are difficulties in the target group. One is the time it takes. A lot of these women can take quite a considerable amount of time to get a job. Where women were found by a violent partner and had to abandon their job to go to a refuge. So, they can't complete the 26 weeks continuous employment. Where women have chosen not to give us evidence because they say, great, thanks McAuley, got my job, I'm out of here, I don't want to see you ever again. That's what we actually want. In fact, we've been penalised, we've been told that our program is empowering women to get their own job because we're actually not a placement service. We work behind them, we help them get their own job. So they're off in the interview, we're sitting in the car waiting for them to get out and have a cup of coffee after and say, how'd it go? Okay, if you didn't get it, let's go for the next one. So we're penalised because we are empowering women. Anyway, to sum up, we know that this work actually does pay for itself from an economic point of view. And Layla is there, and I have, if you're interested, 30 individualised costed case studies, some of which include the employment stuff. So Access Economics, we employed them to analyse 30 cases because we knew what we were doing is right. Their costings were conservative. They said that over 85% of the 30 case studies demonstrated a positive or equal return on investment. They said that this was and I'm going to quote this one because I like it, an astonishing result for clients as vulnerable as those included in the study. Some of the most vulnerable in Victoria with high and complex needs, starting their journey with McAuley with no income, no job, mental health concerns, trauma and escaping family violence. So courage and compassion, the women have it in spades. We sometimes wobble at the knees.
I've got 10 minutes and I've got 10 points to make in relation to this. And the first is that I greet you in relation to a cause in which you're going to see victory. This is going to be won, and it's going to be won in your lifetime. And this is the cause in relation to slavery is something that the Catholic Church is on the front foot in relation to, and you can all have your heads and your hearts held high in respect of this. We are going forward. What are we talking about? We are talking about modern slavery and human trafficking. The continuing existence of slavery in its modern forms is a critical health check on our globalised world. Human trafficking, slavery and slavery-like practices involve the exploitation of people, involve in using violence, threats, false promises, manipulation, abuse of power and other forms of coercion for the profit or gain of someone else. Exploitation of people for the profit or gain of other people. Put simply, it is about taking someone's freedom. Eradication of modern slavery is overcoming a cruel injustice. Seemingly, modern slavery is illegal everywhere, but tens of millions of people are trapped in factories, fields, fisheries, mines, on construction sites, on ships, in private homes and in many other industries. It's estimated there is about 40 million people that are involved. 13 million are involved with forced labour. 27 million are involved with, I beg your pardon, 13 million are involved with forced marriage. 27 million are involved in relation to various forms of forced labour. 16 million are involved in what would be the ordinary goods and services in the economy. Some of the slaves are held captive. Many of the world's slaves are kept in prisons without walls. All of them are producing and providing goods and services for those who wield power and control, or to satisfy the constant supply and demand of the culture that's driving our global economy. They're the living embodiment of the chilling observation: cheap goods, cheap labour and cheap sex. What about ourselves? The truth is, slavery touches the lives of most of us in this room every day through the supply chains of the goods and services we purchase. Do you own a telephone or a computer? Clothing? Shoes? Do you drink coffee or tea? Do you wear jewellery or makeup? Do you buy seafood, pet food, meat, fruit, vegetables, or eat fast food? I'm afraid you and I cannot deny that we benefit from the exploitation of other human beings, in large part because they are invisible to us. Today, the risk that a product or service is tainted with slave labour somewhere in the supply chain occurs in almost all industries, from electronics and high-tech to automotive, steel, mining, agriculture, coffee, seafood. The list is almost limitless. All countries are affected, so too is the other supply chains of the Catholic Church and the Catholic entities in Australia. The best estimate is that there are 6 million people involved there. Now, understand this: many issues divide public opinion across the world: welfare, immigration, defence, tax. But in the case of modern slavery, agreement is total. All 193 UN member states have committed to eradicating child slavery by 2025 and all modern slavery and forced labour by 2030. That's our government's policy. That's our church's policy. That's what we want. We're taking it out in this generation. This commitment means their governments, it's all our governments, should not contribute to the estimated 150 million that this crime generates every year. It's one of the things as taxpayers we can all start demanding, that the government not do that. Now, what is our basis in relation to this? There's a mandate in Catholic social teaching in relation to the eradication of modern slavery and human trafficking. There is an urgent need for all those who are Catholics, and indeed for all Catholic institutions, to take steps to bring freedom to those enslaved. The election of Pope Francis to the chair of St. Peter in March 2013 has proved to be momentous for the anti-slavery movement and in the contemporary world. From Rome, over the past 6 years, the Church and the world have heard a constant flow of statements and exhortations from the Holy Father in respect of the eradication of modern slavery and human trafficking. Pope Francis is perhaps the greatest anti-slavery advocate in our world today. In 2013, he declared human trafficking to be an open wound on the contemporary church, a scourge on the body of Christ and a crime against humanity. On the day in 2014, he pledged with other global religious leaders to collectively work to bring each faith community together to rid the world of the affront to human dignity and defilement that is human trafficking and slavery. In 2015, the Holy Father was more than the inspiration to the adoption of Goal 8.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which sets out for the immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labour and human trafficking. Pope Francis is firm and consistent in his strong conviction that we will be victorious over modern slavery and human trafficking. He exhorts the contemporary world and the contemporary church to provide the collective will and organisation to defeat modern slavery in its manifestations in this generation. That's us. Without a doubt, this is one of the great and most inspiring visions of freedom in our world. How's Australia responded to all of this? Well, in March 2017, Archbishop Fisher, the Archbishop of Sydney, went before the Parliament of New South Wales and pledged that in respect of his diocese there would be a program directed towards the eradication of modern slavery in the supply chains and life of the Archdiocese, and he in that way demonstrated that he believed that what Pope Francis wanted was clear enough. In proposing action in his own archdiocese, and I quote this, Archbishop Fisher stated, "It is not enough for groups such as churches to lecture or exhort the rest of the community in such matters for modern slavery and human trafficking. We must demonstrate our own willingness to act where we can. The Vatican has already committed itself to slavery-proofing its supply chains. It is no small task to ensure everything we use has been obtained ethically, that everything we obtain has been produced and supplied ethically and sustainably, and that those upon whom we rely and with whom we are affiliated are like-minded. It is no small task, but we must try. Pope Francis has pointed out buying goods is not just a commercial matter, it has moral dimensions. As a result of that, he established a task force of which I have the honour to be the chairman. And he has a task force that was to produce a report to him as to what the extent was of the supply chains of the Archdiocese of Sydney were affected by risk of exposure to modern slavery and human trafficking. He wanted a report that was brought down on a supply chain strategy, an ethical purchasing strategy, an anti-slavery education and external engagement strategy, anti-slavery welfare services and an ethical investment policy. All of that has come to pass. All of that has been the background to the Catholic response to the Modern Slavery Act and to the preparation of a major national conference last year in relation to that. I can only say that there has now come out of that ACAN, which is the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network, to respond to the Modern Slavery Act, and that the Catholic Church is on the basis of being able to prepare reports for 56 entities that will be required to report, that will be of the highest standard. The last thing to be said in this respect is this. St. Bakita, the patron saint of modern slavery victims, canonised, a former slave canonised by St. John Paul II in 2001. St. Bakita's Day this year, 8th of February, the Archbishop of Sydney received a letter from the minister administering the Modern Slavery Act, commending the Archdiocese of Sydney and all that they were doing, and the anti-slavery task force in relation to the work that he saw as being directed against slavery in the country, and of the Catholic Church in general in what it was able to do, and the reflection by people that this put the Catholic Church in a position where this was going forward in a way that is better than virtually all the corporate sector and the government sector at the present time. I have as well material for you on the ethical purchasing scheme Shop for Good, which is being distributed, taking root in the parishes at the moment, and provides a list of goods that are being done there. An ethical purchasing scheme will come out soon, and we have a program in the Catholic schools. So that's the 10 matters I wanted to cover. I'm sorry it's taken more than 10 minutes, and I apologise to His Lordship for that, but I thought it was important to say that. Let me conclude by just saying this. I'm a grandfather. In April last year, our youngest daughter and third daughter had her third daughter. She lives in Connecticut. We went over to Connecticut. That little girl was born on Easter Saturday. That little girl will never be a slave. But all the work that we can put in may result in the situation that other little girls and boys born on that day will avoid slavery. What we are talking about and what the Pope wants is that this generation seriously works to take it out. We don't want another generation in slavery. The most famous quote in the whole of the anti-slavery cause were words that William Wilberforce used in the British Parliament in 1792 when he outlined much of what was wrong and dreadful and appalling about slavery. And he turned to everyone in the House of Commons, as I turn to you today, and say, and finished, you may not do anything about it, but never again can you say you did not know. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm very privileged to be at this National Conference of Catholic Social Services, whose mission I am particularly close to by virtue of my personal interest, as well as by virtue of my being the chair of the Bishop's Commission for Social Justice. Now, as you know, I'm also a former boat person, and the issue of people seeking refuge and asylum becomes rather personal to me. I consider it my vocation to tell people that the vulnerable wanting to have a dignified life, wanting to have a better future for themselves and their children should not be simply seen as a burden or a liability to our society, but they can, and they do indeed, become great contributors and builders of our nation. And the public discourse in this country on asylum seeking is still very toxic, characterized by demonization and the fear of the other, the outsider. And I think it pertains to us to change that discourse, to change that political narrative into something more positive about the courage and the determination and the drive for a better future, which often is not recognized. The experience of the Vietnamese refugees is clear evidence that even the most traumatized group of people can be integrated into our multicultural society and can make a positive contribution. The fear that our social cohesion might be undermined or that our very future might be compromised has been proven unfounded largely. Today, Asian Australians have joined mainstream Australia in every aspect of our society. Our nation has evolved to become a much more dynamic, diverse, and prosperous nation. To be sure, each group represents or presents its own challenge to Australia, and yet we have consistently risen to the challenge and become more enriched, more diverse as a result. I contend that Australia will have failed to live up to our best tradition as a generous, compassionate society, and we demean ourselves when we adopt harsh and unprincipled policies towards refugees and asylum seekers. It pains me to witness the dismantling of our country's long-held tradition of welcoming migrants and refugees. That tradition is being enshrined even in our national anthem for those who've come across the seas who have boundless plains to share. Pope Francis is not afraid of calling out systems that drive oppression and exploitation. And unless these systems are recognized, exposed, confronted, and dismantled, fundamental change will not occur. The change we need goes beyond national interests, and Francis pointed out that the system or the systemic and structural change in terms of what he called the globalization of hope. A globalization of hope is a hope that springs from people and takes root among the poor and must replace the globalization of exclusion and indifference. And as we know, Francis does not only talk the talk, he also walks the walk. He puts courage and compassion in doing very unpopular things, like going to Lampedusa, an island that is Italy's equivalent to our Christmas island, in a socio-political climate in Europe where the tide had turned against migrants, especially Muslim African migrants. The Pope's action provoked strong, fierce criticisms, even from his own flock. It amounted to a kind of existential risk. This risk associated with the fight in favor of God's justice for the poor places one in a liminal place, a place where the Christian leader gives a prophetic witness before he speaks the word of hope. I endeavor to follow Pope Francis's lead in advocating for asylum seekers and refugees. I've been privileged to take part in many public events for asylum seekers and refugees, Palm Sunday rallies, or public demonstrations, forums, and face-to-face meetings. Last November, I went with a delegation of Catholic leaders, including Josh here, to meet some of the asylum seekers who had been transferred from Manus Island to Port Moresby. And we wanted to simply show our solidarity and support to these human beings, fellow human beings. And there was an incident which I thought highlighted the kind of demonization and fear that's so embedded in our anti-refugee, anti-asylum seeker culture. We gathered in front of a so-called immigration facility built by the Australian government in Bomana, which is just a few miles from the capital. And we formed a circle and we linked hands and prayed outside the prison, where some of these asylum seekers were kept in a deplorable environment. And 10 minutes or so into the course of our action, Anglo-Celtic kind of person who emerged out of the facility and gave orders to the local staff to ask us to leave, even though we were simply praying in front of the facility, which was devoid of people. It's quite an isolated area. It's a kind of response that was driven by fear. And yet I believe that it is for the sake of the vulnerable, the oppressed, that we as Christian people and Christian leaders in particular must be in it for the long game. It is not simply an end of a policy in a certain area, but it pertains to us to witness to the gospel of life and dignity as we continue to be an advocate for a world, a society that is in accordance with the gospel. Thank you.